Hi, class. This week we will be addressing the topic of free will and whether or not we have a free will. So let's just dive right in. And there are two basic arguments. The first is that people do not have free will and so are following a path that is, in a sense, already set out before them. They are unable to alter it. And this is the argument for determinism. The second is that people have free will and so have an independent role to play in how their lives unfold. And this is the argument for indeterminism. Another way of putting this is as follows. Determinism is the view that every act that is involved in an act is caused by some other event. I apologize. It's the view that every event that is involved in an act is caused by some other event. Indeterminism is the view that an act or some event that is essential to the act is not caused at all. So we're really focused on cause and effect here. So a good way to look at the problem is by imagining a fork in the road. To say that someone has free will is to say that when they decide among forks in the road of time, they at least sometimes are able to take more than one of the forks. In other words, someone with free will may travel along path A and get to a point where they can choose from paths B, C, or D. She is not confined to just one path, but has several open to her. For indeterminism to be true, she must at least be able to choose from two paths. In contrast, to say that people do not have free will is to say that a cause and effect chain leads to just one single path. In other words, event A causes B, which causes C, which causes D, and so on. When someone has free will, they are free from such a causal chain. Someone who finds himself at point A can freely choose at least one or two other paths, such as paths B, C, or D. So let's consider an example of someone who clearly lacks free will. So this is a quote from Peter van Inwagen, who teaches at Notre Dame. So if John is locked in a room and doesn't know that he is locked in, and if he is in the process of deliberating about whether to leave, one of the alternative futures he is contemplating, leaving, is, in point of fact, not open to him, and he thus lacks free will in the matter of staying or leaving. So this would be a clear case of lacking free will. A determinist would argue that this is analogous to our situation. We may think we have choices beyond the ones we actually choose, and we could have moved along different paths, but that is like John thinking he can leave the room when he's actually locked in. So how do we account for the fact that it often appears to us as though we have many options? We can represent this with a road that gives the illusion that there are other possibilities. In this case, all of our options are perceivable, but paths C and D are not actually connected to our path, and so they are not real options. So the deterministic path only provides one real option. At point A, you will choose point B. But it gives us the illusion that there are other possibilities. And that, the determinists would say, is a result of the limitations of human vision. We don't realize that we're in a locked room. So we think we can get out, but that's just a fact that we don't know what's actually happening in the world, and that our path is already laid out in front of us. So the path with the real connected forks is representative of the concept of free will, where we can choose more than one. So why debate this? Why is this debate important? Well, first, it's an important metaphysical debate. Is reality a pre-chosen path, or are we just pawns that move along it? It's important for self-understanding. We feel free, but is that feeling illusory? You might ask yourself that. Should I feel totally responsible for how my life unfolds? It's an important debate for understanding others. For instance, we might know someone who is mean-spirited. Is that person really mean-spirited or a victim of his or her upbringing? It's also important for moral philosophy. If people are not free to act differently than they act, is it right to morally condemn them for their actions and say that they are immoral people? And it's important for social justice. Depending on whether we think people are free or not will influence how we, say, treat prisoners. If criminals are not free to act otherwise, we might prioritize rehabilitation rather than punishment. The thinking is perhaps if we give them the right kind of experiences in prison, a cause and effect chain will result in which they are released and they can't help but follow the law from that point on. Okay, so for now, let's just assume determinism is correct, and we're going to explore this theory. So all of our actions are really effects that are brought about by causes. What are the causes that can determine our actions? Well, there's two kinds of causes for our actions, and that would be internal and external. So let's consider internal first. Desires or beliefs are internal causes, as they can cause us to act in certain ways. For instance, if I have a craving for sugar, that craving might propel me to get a cookie. I might even say I had a craving for sugar and that's why I'm eating a cookie. In other words, I'm attributing my act of eating a cookie to a desire. Likewise, a belief can cause us to act in certain ways. If I believe that it's freezing cold outside, even as I haven't yet been outside, this will propel me to wear a heavy jacket before opening the door. So determinists typically argue that humans do not freely choose their desires or beliefs. Rather, they emerge from things that are beyond their control, and they propel us to act in certain and predictable ways. So let's consider the case of moral psychology. Moral psychology refers to the study of moral development in people, and it's a field in which psychologists and philosophers have teamed up. So psychologists study how humans function in moral contexts, and philosophers consider how the results of those studies impact the debate on ethical theory. So studies show us that our moral behaviors are a function of situations rather than personal character. So whether we act morally or immorally has more to do with the situation we're in than who we are or think we are. And this is consistent with determinism because it indicates that things are beyond our control, propel us to act in certain and predictable ways. So let's consider some of the research findings. So in 1972, psychologists set up a controlled experiment where they took a public payphone and they put a dime in the coin's return slot. And sometimes they took that dime out. Meanwhile, they placed a person on the scene who was asking for help. And they found that when people came out of the phone booth who just found that coin that was left in there, they were far more likely to help the person who asked for it than people who went in there and didn't find a coin. That's one study. This one's my favorite. In 1973, a study was set up where Princeton seminary students were just given a lecture on the Good Samaritan story. And that's a story in the Bible where a person was stripped of clothing and beaten and left half dead on the side of the road. and that person was passed by a priest and another person, but a good Samaritan stopped and helped him. So the story is a parable to encourage people to help those in need. Well, then they would release one of the seminary students who had just reflected on this story. And they pulled that seminary student aside and told them that they had to get to this meeting and they were late. And the study showed that when the student thought that they were late to an appointment, let me back up. At the same time, they placed someone in the hallway who was distressed and slumped in the doorway and needed help. So then they told this seminary student that they were running late for an appointment. And when that person darted out into the hallway, they were far less likely to help the person who was slumped and in distress, even after just reflecting on the Good Samaritan story. Okay, so that's another study. In 1975, a study showed that people were much less likely to help someone who, quote, accidentally dropped a pile of papers. This is someone who was staged. They had him drop papers. When the ambient noise was 85 decibels than when it was 65 decibels. So when they had some ambient noise that people weren't even really focused on or aware of, if that noise was louder, people were less likely to help someone who needed it. And a recent study shows that people are far more likely to get change for $1 if they're standing outside a fragrant bakery rather than standing outside, say, a neutral-smelling dry goods store, something with no odor. So what all these studies show us is that our desire to be helpful, generous people may be caused by factors that we don't control, such as good fortune, finding that coin in the slot, schedules, thinking that we have time to help, ambient noise levels, and even smells. These things influence us and may cause us to be helpful or generous or not. So philosophers consider these results and question whether people are free to act morally or whether we act as a result of external factors, including factors that we aren't even aware of. The problem is that if people are just acting under the influence of their environment, then our moral acts aren't really praiseworthy. And we also shouldn't be blamed when we act immorally. After all, our acts are causally determined by the environments and circumstances we find ourselves in, and it doesn't seem right to condemn someone for something they didn't have any control over. So, traditionally, philosophers have held that when we act morally, it's a result of first confronting an issue, perhaps experiencing emotions, thinking about it rationally and making a decision, and then acting. This is the traditional way and the indeterministic way. But moral psychologists, in alignment with determinists, argue something different. They argue that we confront an issue, perhaps experience an emotion, we then act, and then we try to rationally justify that act after the fact. So this is where this gives us the illusion that we acted based on reason, but rather reason is used to help us feel okay about what we did. Okay? And if we act before we deliberate, then we've already traveled a path that's been set out without thinking about other possibilities and other paths. So the idea here and why this is a deterministic approach is that rationality and deliberation happens after we've already made our choice and we've acted. Okay? So we don't control that path. Okay, Our book considers the case of behaviorism, which is a psychological school founded by B.F. Skinner. So it starts with the premise that humans act in predictable ways, in line with laws of cause and effect. In other words, people are like machines. You provide inputs, and a human will respond with predictable outputs. Think about this in terms of moral psychology. If you want someone to be more helpful, try to create a world that smells better. That's kind of an absurd way of looking at it, but the idea is the same. Create an environment that is conducive to making people generous, rather than to try to convince someone that they should be generous. So behaviorists would argue that if we want to make people act morally, we need to provide them with a positive reinforcement for doing so and negative reinforcement when they don't. While we wouldn't necessarily morally condemn someone for, say, lying, since a chain of cause and effect led them to lie, we might still punish them for it so they won't do it the next time. It's like as with a drone. If we just disagree with a drone attack, we don't morally condemn the drone, say it was an evil drone. It's a machine, after all, and it's just doing what it's been programmed to do. So if humans are input and output machines, we also wouldn't morally condemn them, but we would perhaps try to change their behaviors, just like we might reprogram a drone. So many people, on a related note, justify the death penalty because it is a deterrent to heinous crimes. In other words, people are influenced by their fear of death, and that fear ensures that they don't commit heinous crimes. If the death penalty wasn't around, more people might commit heinous crimes. So whether the death penalty is actually an effective deterrent is debatable, but people who come from a behaviorist standpoint might say that it should exist to provide a deterrent for would-be criminals. It's a negative reinforcement that helps promote good acts in the world. Again, a behaviorists would argue that we can't trust people to not commit heinous crimes out of their own volition or their own will, because they don't have a free will. We rather need to create cause and effect chains that support a peaceful society. Okay, our book also considers Sigmund Freud's deterministic theory. And that theory says that humans are motivated to act in specific ways through hidden and mysterious forces. So these forces are the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious aspects of a person's personality. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on all that here. It's laid out all in our book, and please read that section in our textbook and let me know if you have any questions. I don't want to just rehash it here, because you already have it in the book. But Freud's theory is aligned with determinism in that human actions are manipulated by forces that are beyond our immediate control, meaning that while we may think we have a number of options set out before us, we can only choose one, given our primal drives, our early childhood experiences, and the interplay of the id, ego, and superego, which are unconscious, so uncontrolled by us, by our will, unconscious mechanisms that make up our personalities. So we've discussed psychological theories that support determinism, in other words, internal causes of actions. We can also, of course, be physically limited in what we can do. And these limitations are referred to as external causes. So we can be, for instance, constrained by force. Going back to an example I already kind of discussed, let's suppose John is locked in a room. He doesn't have the freedom to get out. He desires to go out of the room, and that desire feels real. But remember, he doesn't realize he's locked in a room, and his only real path is to remain in the locked room. So he isn't free to do other than what he's doing, which is to be in a locked room. Likewise, someone in jail is unable to walk out of their own volition. A football player who really wants to get a touchdown but is tackled short of the end zone is not free to get that touchdown. These are kind of straightforward and obvious limitations to our free will. We can also be constrained by natural laws. So the argument goes, if all that exists is material, then natural laws govern all of our actions. Just as it's natural laws that lead balls on a pool table to move in the way they do, not like, say, spiritual forces. But this makes us question, is everything that exists material? Like, for instance, what about mental processes, such as thoughts or emotions? My thoughts and emotions aren't physical. I can't touch them or point to them. They don't have a color or a weight. They are immaterial and not physical. In what sense, then, are they material and governed by natural laws? So the materialists would respond by saying, as philosopher Paul Churchland does, that, quote, different sensory mental processes such as taste, touch, sight, etc. are produced by distinct but characteristic spiking patterns of the sensory pathways that project through the brain. Remember, the brain is material. It's an object. You can point to it and weigh it and see it and so on. So, for example, non-colorblind people will report seeing red only if there is a neural activity of a certain sort going on. So the physical brain gives rise to thoughts and emotions. It doesn't go the other way around. The brain, which is material and is subject to natural laws, is in control. It's the author, the creator of seemingly immaterial thoughts and emotions. So the point being, if desires and emotions are ultimately based on physical processes, those physical processes are subject to natural laws of cause and effect, and they aren't things that we can manipulate. So here's a very long quote from a Columbia University publication that gets into more details about this. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it. You can obviously read it in the PowerPoint that I'm presenting and just fast forward here. But the relatively recent introduction of neuroimaging techniques, particularly fMRIs and PETs, provides a new perspective on the emotion in the intact human brain and have the potential to identify which brain areas are consistently and specifically associated with particular types of emotional states. 15 years of neuroimaging research has investigated the neural underpinnings of emotions, including responses to basic affective stimuli such as pictures or odors. The experience and regulation of the discrete emotional events that we refer to as disgust, anger, and desire. Note, these are all things that can influence us to act. And the perception of emotion in others. These findings have the potential to shed new light on what emotions are and how they work. So note that these scientists are trying to describe what emotions are and how they work by looking at a physical brain. That again is subject to cause and effect and can only do as natural law will allow it to do. A particularly important structure is the midbrain PAG, which is thought to coordinate coherent physiological and behavioral responses to threat. So the author of this article makes the case that brain activities, which are neural systems that are grounded in natural law, give rise to emotions, those non-physical feelings that we get, which results in action. In other words, consistent with moral psychologists, the chain goes from physical brain activities to emotions to actions. Justifying our actions rationally is not part of this chain and so likely comes after. And that's why we have the illusion that we could have done otherwise. For the determinist, the argument is that our actions at their foundation are guided by neural systems. Those neural systems are influenced by natural law, not a person's will. Okay? And so are part of a cause and effect chain that can only produce one path. Okay? This sums up the argument for determinism. The idea that our path is laid out before us. It's a series of cause and effect. We have the illusion that we can manipulate our path, but every choice we ever make, every decision we make, and every path that we follow is the only one that was truly available to us. Okay, let's consider the case for freedom. So as we can see, there are good reasons for thinking that human beings lack free will. But there are also good reasons to think that we do have a free will. Remember, philosophy deals with questions that cannot be definitively answered. So there's always another side, another angle. People who argue that we have free will typically think that, one, we confront a situation, we may or may not experience a related emotion, we then think about it and hopefully use solid reasoning skills, and we then act. And because acting is the last step, and during the reasoning stage we could envision several paths to take, we can indeed choose from a number of paths, not just the one we ultimately took. So Aristotle, we talked about Aristotle last week. He believed that people have free will. And he starts with the founding assumption that people are responsible for their actions and therefore must be free to follow more than one path. So he differs from determinists because his starting point is a moral one. It's related to the issue of holding people responsible for what they do. And this is very different than from the determinist argument that we reviewed, which starts from a more metaphysical place. What's the brain? How does it work? How does it cause us to have emotions? How does it cause us to act? And so on. So Aristotle's not starting from a modern psychologist's perspective, but rather from a moral perspective. Now, he did recognize that over the years, people develop personalities and end up defining them. So as this happens, our ability to do other than what we do becomes more and more limited. So for instance, someone who has spent many years cheating develops the habit of cheating. At some point, they start to cheat automatically or out of habit every chance they get. So it looks like they aren't free to do otherwise. In other words, they confront a situation in which they can cheat and they act. That is, they cheat. However, Aristotle argued that we should still hold people responsible for what they do because at some point they were free to choose any number of different paths. At some point in the past, before they developed that habit of cheating. So that is, this person was free to develop the virtue of fairness when they were much younger, but they chose not to at that point. In other words, they still had multiple forks in the road open to them at some point, even if they don't have them open now, and cheating has become so ingrained in their personality that they can't help but cheat. So long as we have more than one road we can follow, we are not completely subject to a cause and effect chain, and we enjoy some freedom, even if that freedom becomes more and more limited as we grow older and follow familiar patterns. So again, note that all it takes is one instance where someone can manipulate their path and choose which path to go down to reject determinism. William James, he also rejected determinism, and he represents a school of thought called pragmatism. Pragmatism holds that a claim or theory is true if it works satisfactorily. In other words, we should accept theories when there are positive consequences that come with accepting them. All unpractical ideas should be rejected. So James argued that it's impossible to prove that determinism isn't true. But we can say with certainty that it is impractical. So he argues that it should be thrown out. First, determinism goes against our basic intuition that we make choices among a number of real possibilities. So let's consider an example. Let's say that you were picking a class to fulfill a GE credit. And there was both a history class and this philosophy class, and they both had space. And suppose you were interested in both equally. To say that you really only had one choice, which is the one you took, this philosophy class, it doesn't jive with our feelings about the situation. It's therefore not helpful for us. It's more practical to roll with our feeling that we do have genuine choices to make, especially as we try to learn from our experiences and our mistakes and try to make better choices in the future and so on. There's a real practical element in thinking that we can actually shape our lives. Like I said, we're going to try to reflect on the choices we've made, and sometimes those choices illuminate things about who we are and what our goals are. And we reflect on that and hopefully, make better choices in the future or continue to make good choices if we've been happy with the path that we've been following. So it's real practical to think that we can choose the path that we're walking. Second, and this is aligned with Aristotle's argument, determinism also goes against our moral sensibilities. We typically want to hold people responsible for the things they do. We want to praise those who act virtuously, like firefighters who run into burning buildings to save people. We want to praise those people. And we also want to condemn those who don't act well. For instance, we want to punish criminals and say that they deserve their punishment. So determinism doesn't allow for this, and William James sees this as a big weakness in the theory. You can't condemn someone when they had no realistic choice to do otherwise. Okay, well, this gives us a lot to think about. Please email me if you have any questions about the determinism, indeterminism debate, anything I said in this lecture, anything that you read in the readings that you're struggling with. Next week, we will start reading the other assigned text in this class, which is Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism and Human Emotion. And he contends that humans not only have free will, but that we are radically free and totally responsible for our being in the world. And I think it'll be interesting to, we've been reading from a secondary source. Our author's been writing about different theories. Now we're going to be reading a book written by a famous philosopher. So if you struggle with any of the writing or the content, again, don't hesitate to email me questions, and we can also meet at a time that works for all of us on Tuesdays or Thursdays. Okay, well, this week, just like last week, there's a discussion forum. Same thing, be sure to post and respond to 2 classmates. And then there was also a reaction paper, and it's an informal paper. It doesn't have to be formatted in APA or MLA, although if you do quote anyone, I do want to see quotation marks. I do want to see an in-text citation as well as a works cited at the end. So I need you to avoid plagiarism and properly quote and cite any work if you decide to do that. It's not a requirement for the reaction paper. But I'm putting up the prompt for the reaction paper, and basically there's 2 prompts that you can choose to write on. You just write on one. And if you have any questions about it, let me know.